Thanks so much for joining us today. First of all, how did your first session as Lieutenant Governor go?
Well, I'd have to say that on balance it went very well. Obviously, there's a lot of new things to learn on a personal level. I was pretty entrenched in the House ways and managing the floor in the way we always do in the House by tradition. And then I had to learn a new tradition. I am not the fastest learner in the world, but I picked it up pretty quick. It kind of became a running joke. People kept tallies on on all of my my miscues and my faux pas, if you will, referencing the House when it should have referenced the Senate, or the clerk when it should have been the secretary. But so that was all in good fun, and it made me want to do better. And I think I was starting to pull it off by the last couple of months.
Probably nothing unexpected, I'm sure.
No. I enjoy the parliamentary process, and the underlying process is the same both in the House and the Senate. There's different rules and different nuances to the rules, but by and large it has a familiar ring to it.
You spent 20 years in the House, first as a member and then in leadership. In that time, there were, of course, there are always tensions between the legislature and the executive branch.
Right.
After 4 months in the executive branch, has your perspective changed at all?
Well, I can report that there's still some tension.
We've noticed, right?
But I think we have a system of checks and balances where creative tension is baked into the system. I don't think that we're well served when the House and the Senate get along 100%. I don't think we're well served when the legislature and the executive branch get along 100%. Now, get along, I mean in a civil, respectful way, but there are differences of opinions, there are differences in approach, and I think that makes for a more healthy system. It's how we manage that difference of opinion, that conflict that spells our success. And I think by and large we were pretty respectful of one another. But being locked in that building for 90 days a year and having 400 problems come in the front door and have to have solutions go out the back door, that can bring out the worst and the best in people, and we saw that. So there's always going to be some creative tension, and this session was no different.
In your time in the legislature, you were very focused on water policy and infrastructure issues. And over the past couple years, of course, Idaho has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in water and transportation and broadband, including $750 million last year, another $150 million for water this year. I wanted to get an update on how those investments are going so far, now that we're about a year into those appropriations going on.
We're just one more year down on the drawing board, basically. Keep in mind that we live in the fastest growing state in the nation, or we're certainly one of the fastest growing states. And so, but we're not getting any more water just because we're growing quickly. So there's increased competition for every gallon of water in our river systems. And so these investments that we're talking about are tailored to make that water go forward, whether it's raising Anderson Ranch Dam, whether it's making our canal systems more efficient, whether it's, since we're not building more surface storage, it's about infrastructure to get the water out of the river and into our aquifers, because that's a great place to store water. It comes back out slowly, or you can pump it out when you need it. And so the money that we've been investing back into Idaho is for just that. It's planning ahead. We need a sustainable water source here. We need to drought-proof our state as best we can, because we live in the arid West. And we're never going to get, for the foreseeable future, we're not going to get any more water than we've got in the past. And so we've got to make that stretch, make it go as far as we possibly can, and provide water for our growing communities and our manufacturing. Agriculture is still a large chunk of Idaho's economy. And we in agriculture need to use that water more efficiently, make it go farther, adjust our rotations and our crops so that we're not always using high water consumptive crops that we have, small grains as well, that use way less water than corn or alfalfa or potatoes and sugar beets. But those are the crops that put Idaho on the map. I mean, we're the third largest dairy producing state in the nation, number one in potatoes, et cetera. And so there's always going to be this balancing act and a rotation, if you will, of the crops so that we can have our high water use crops, but also have enough of the low water use crops to balance the water budget.
And that conversation strikes me as a big culture shift. You need to get a lot of farmers on board who have depended on those high water crops. How are those conversations going?
Well, I think they're going well. One thing about Idaho's farmers is they're up to speed. They understand the water levels in the aquifer. They understand what it's like to try to farm in the arid West, specifically Idaho. They want to maximize their production, but at the same time, have you ever met a farmer that didn't introduce himself as a second or third or fourth generation farmer? That's because baked into their psychic is this desire that this generation doesn't take away from the next generation. And so if we're taking more water out of the aquifer than is coming in, they know that because they live that, they're measuring that. And and so we need to provide assistance so that we can sustain that, and we can, if we're going to balance the water budget coming out of the aquifer, we can augment that budget through managed recharge. And that's what a lot of this money is going towards.
We don't have to worry just about drought when we're talking about water. You mentioned this before. We also have to worry about growth.
Right.
Earlier this week, you spoke at the Rural Success Summit in Western Idaho with other Idaho agriculture and business leaders. What were the concerns that came up during that summit?
Well, I think some of the concerns were, just to name a couple, number one is there's sometimes a lag between the prosperity that the Treasure Valley experiences, economically, and that doesn't necessarily get out into the more rural parts of the state. Although those parts of the states are growing quickly as well, and that's where I live, and I notice that down in the Magic Valley. But I think the people in Western Idaho were wanting to make sure that there was broadband infrastructure. I mean, that's such a critical component to any success going forward economically. And there's not the best connectivity everywhere in the state. So we still have some work to do. The good news is that there's some money available to increase this connectivity and to do the parts that the private sector it's not economical for them to do. So we do those parts of the system, and then the private sector branches out from there. So I think that was one of the main things that they were concerned about. They're proud. We talked about our state and the state of the state. They, I think, for the most part, feel like the state is well run. We've had back-to-back tax decreases and rebates. This year, we've taken the surplus and invested it back into returning money to citizens through the property tax and making the investments that we've talked about, not only in our infrastructure, our water, and our roads and bridges, but also back into our education system. Everybody knows it doesn't matter whether you're rural or urban or suburban, every parent, every grandparent knows that the secret to those kids' success is having access to a good education. And they're concerned that the rural parts of the state have the access to a good education as well.
And of course, we can't talk about rural success without talking about that education component. This
Correct.
was a big legislative session for education, both K through 12 and higher ed.
Right.
Just briefly, can you touch on some of the highlights and how that will affect those rural Idaho schools?
Well, it's going to affect them very positive. Remember, what we did this session in January started last special session last summer. And just quickly to review, what we did then was to carve out $410 million ongoing and put that in a bucket and put a sticky note on the side of it that said for education. And then that idea refined, and we split the bucket up into two buckets, one for K-12 and one for in-demand careers. We wanted to create a system where every Idaho kid could get an Idaho job if they chose. And so so the session picked up right where the special session left off. The old legislature didn't want to get too specific for the new legislature. They carved the money out and again put a sticky note on the bucket and said, hey, use this for education, but the details are to be worked out in the 2023 session. And that's what happened. So we did a bunch of things that we can go into if you'd like in K-12, but I think more importantly, we kicked off the Idaho Launch Program, where every graduating high school senior from Idaho, whether it's through a GED or the more traditional diploma, qualifies if for an $8,000 2-year, $8,000 over 2 years grant to go into a program that is not a traditional academic thing. It's more about the trades. Every in-demand career from welders to carpenters, electricians, plumbers, HVAC, cybersecurity, truck drivers, pilots, teachers. We need teachers. These are all, and that's only to name a few. We need linemen, working on our electrical infrastructure. And so that's not an exhaustive list, but this launch grant would be available to students that go into those programs. And we think that will be a game changer long term. Again, our goal is to have a vibrant enough economy to absorb every high school graduating Idaho senior back into our economy. And an Idaho kid always should be able to get an Idaho job. And now we're not every Idaho kid is going to stay in Idaho, and we have a vibrant, dynamic economy. But we want to remove obstacles for our graduating seniors. And that, I think when we look back 10 years from now, we'll point to this turning, as being a turning point for Idaho. Are all the bugs worked out of it? No. But we will do that along the way. But conceptually, there's broad support of this, particularly out in rural Idaho. 65% of our graduating seniors last year didn't go on to any type of an organized program. Many of them went into the workforce, they were able to get a good job, etc., but they didn't better themselves through gaining a skill set. And we need to kind of change that.
All right, Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always my pleasure.